Welcome to Engage, featuring speaker Nicolas Brathwaite, founder and partner, Riverwood Ventures. Sponsored by Connect Silicon Valley, formerly known as the Silicon Valley Prayer Breakfast.
You know, today I'm an investor. I co-founded a private equity firm called Riverwood Capital. And then because I like early stage companies, I also co-founded a VC firm called WRV. And today I'm also part of a hot company called Katera. But I started my career at Intel. And, you know, I've been able to participate in a lot of great things here in Silicon Valley. But really, you know, those things are just about what I do. Who I am is a very simple, very, very simple thing. I am a child of God, saved by grace. I'm a devoted husband, a loving father, a grateful son, and a loyal friend. And I try to live my life that way. That's who I am. You know, a few years ago, a very close friend of mine who happened to be my pastor at the time, Dr. Stanley Long, told me that the best way to understand where God is taking you sometimes is to look back. And so what I thought I'd do this morning is take a look back with you and show you how God has taken me to where I am today. Because I'm not where I am today because of me, because of anything I've done. In fact, I look back often and can't figure out how this actually happened. And sometimes my biggest fear is I'll wake up one day and realize this was all just a big dream. And I'll end up right back in the Caribbean on a beach somewhere as a beach bum, which actually was one of my objectives at one time. I was born on a very tiny island called Carriacou. Most of you have probably never heard of it and should never have heard of it. It's a population of 7,000 people. It's part of a chain of islands called the Grenadines that stretched from St. Vincent in the north to Grenada in the south. Carriacou is the largest of those islands. And it's part of Grenada. It's considered a dependency of Grenada. My parents are from there. They were both born to large families. My dad came from a family of 10. My mom came from a family of 10. I knew 3 of my grandparents. My paternal grandfather died fairly young. My dad was in high school, only 16 years old when he passed away. I never knew him, but he probably had the biggest impact on my life of the 4 grandparents that I had. Because I grew up in a family where his work ethic, his commitment to family, his vision, his ideals, and his values was central to the way we were raised. But I'd like to tell you a little bit about him. He was born in Barbados, and he was an abused child who ran away from home when he was 12 years old. So imagine a 12-year-old running away from home and never going back. He grew up in a number of places. We're not sure everywhere he grew up, but I remember my dad saying when he died he had multiple passports. He lived in Venezuela, he lived in Cuba, he lived in Panama. But he was committed to family, and he was committed to making sure that his children had a better life than he had. And what amazes me about this man is to think about a person who would have left home at 12 years old and grew up, who knows where he grew up and what circumstances he lived through, but to have that kind of commitment to family and the kind of values he had, it still amazes me how that happens, because he didn't grow up in a family where he had that. And when you look at the results of that, you know, his commitment changed the trajectory of our entire family. So my dad, who was his 3rd child, and who was only 16 and in high school when he died, eventually grew up to be knighted by Queen Elizabeth and become the Prime Minister of Grenada. And then here I am, his grandchild, standing in front of you, talking to you today. My mom's family were devout believers. So I grew up going to church every Sunday, going to Sunday school. I'm not going to lie and say I liked it. I didn't have a choice. I didn't go to church because I wanted to go to church. I went to church because I had to go to church. My dad's family were not really churchgoers. But as I said, my mother was devout, and so we went to church and we were taught all the things that young kids are taught in church. And so I knew about Jesus. I had a LinkedIn type connection to Jesus, but I didn't know Jesus. When I was about 16 or 17, I was led to Christ through the love of a Christian classmate. I had a friend who today is still my best friend. And he was kind of weird. He was one of these Christian guys in school and kind of a weird guy. He didn't do the kind of things we did. We liked going out on Sundays on the beach, and he didn't do that stuff because he had to go to church. And afternoons after school, he went to stuff at church. We never knew exactly what. And he would invite me often. But I would never go because I had other things that were more important to me than going to church at the time, especially since I was going to church up until that time, being made to go to church by my mother. And now I was in high school and I didn't always have to go, so I didn't. But this was the first person who really exposed me to what Christian love looked like. And here's how it happened. So he would invite me to church, I would never go. And he called me up one Saturday because the church was having a picnic, the school was having a picnic on the Sunday. And he suggested to me that I should not go to that picnic because he had a dream that I went to the picnic and I drowned. I could tell you that was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard in my life, and I broke out laughing because I was a decent swimmer. I wasn't a great swimmer, but I was a decent swimmer. I knew how to handle myself in the water, and there was no way I was going to drown going to a picnic. So I asked him if he was going to go, and he told me no because he had to go to church and he wasn't going to go. But when I showed up at the picnic that Sunday morning, he was there. And I said to him, "Why are you here? I thought you were going to church." And he said, "Well, I'm here to make sure you don't drown today." So I had never had anybody outside of my family care for me that much that they would actually show up to make sure something didn't happen. This is a guy I just knew from school. So you can imagine the next time he asked me to go to church with him, I actually couldn't say no. Like, how could you say no the next time this guy asked you to go to church? So the next time he asked me to go to church, I went. And I went to his church, and it was a strange church to me. I'd never been to a church like that before where people seem like all happy and jumping up and clapping and doing stuff like that. So, he asked me again, and I went back, and I kept going with him on a regular basis. And eventually, one day, there was an altar call, and I felt the Spirit saying to me I should take this step. And that's how I became a Christian. And the message there that I use often is to tell people, I've walked down the street and I've heard people tell me all kinds of stuff about hell and damnation and what will happen if I don't do whatever. And those things mean nothing to me. But the demonstration of love that this person showed me is what drew me to Christ. And oftentimes we forget that the centrality of Christianity is love. It's God's love for us and his command that we love each other as he loves us. And that's what this friend of mine demonstrated to me. Now today, he is still my best friend. And the interesting thing about it is we were in high school together for 2 years. Because I was at high school, I went to for 2 years. My dad was a diplomat, and so we lived in multiple countries. I actually went to high school in 3 different countries. It's not high school like here, it's a British system, so high school is longer. We don't have middle school. But I only lived in the same country with this friend of mine for 2 years. And 40 years later, he's still my best friend. He's now a pastor, by the way. So I lived in, as I mentioned, in multiple places, including in South America and Canada and other places. I went to school in Canada. And when I got to university, I must admit that I did not continue to be as a devout Christian as I should have been, and I strayed. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that. One of the interesting things for me is how God uses his sheep to keep guiding other sheep. When I read the 23rd Psalm, which is my favorite scripture, because it says so much, it tells me so much about me. And we talk about the shepherd, and oftentimes when people think about the shepherd, they think about the staff and the rod. But for me, I also think about how shepherds use other sheep to keep the ones that tend to stray inside in the middle and guide them. And that is how I have seen my life. Times when things were not going well, I look back and I see how God has been able to send others to me and surround me and take me back in the direction in which I needed to go, and how he has just orchestrated things in my life. I have never applied for a job in my life. I went to school in Canada, went to undergrad and into grad school, and I enjoyed school. I would probably be in school forever. I mean, one of the reasons I like visiting Google sometimes, it reminds me of a campus, and I never worked there, but that would be a cool place to work just because of the campus atmosphere. In my final months at school, one of my friends asked me what I was going to do. I had not thought about it. Now, I'm not saying anybody should follow my way of doing things, because it probably is not a good way. And we were sitting down, hanging out on campus, and someone asked me if I had a resume. Now, I am like a month from finishing school. I didn't know what a resume was. That is a true story. I had never heard the term resume in my life. I had heard CV. I didn't know what CV meant, but I had heard the term CV. But resume, I'd never heard that term. And this friend of mine decided that she was going to take matters into her own hands, and she decided to do a resume for me. Now, there wasn't much on the resume. I'd never worked. So she did this resume. She asked me a bunch of questions, and she was in law school, so I think it was some kind of practice thing for her, I assume. And she came back a couple of weeks later, and she had this half-a-page resume. I don't know if it was a good resume or a bad resume. It was a nice paper. It looked pretty nice. And she had 8 copies. And she handed me these 8 copies, which I didn't know what I was going to do with them, but another friend of mine happened to be there, and she said, "Can I have one?" So, of course, I had 8. I gave her one. And somehow or the other, she ran into an Intel recruiter and handed that Intel recruiter that resume. And I got a call from Intel. Now, you would think that I would have responded immediately to that call from Intel, but I didn't, because I couldn't understand why somebody from Intel was calling me. I had not applied for a job at Intel. I had not spoken to anybody from Intel. I was in Toronto, actually I was in Waterloo at University of Waterloo, and Intel was over here, and I didn't return the call. And there were several other calls, and I did not return those either. But I finished up, I defended my thesis, and my parents invited me, and my mother was in Grenada at the time, and she invited me to come to Grenada for a few weeks. And so I headed down there, but I decided on my way there I'll stop in Barbados and visit a cousin that I hadn't seen for a while. So I stopped there, and she was driving me around, and she drove me past this Intel building. So I started to tell her about these calls I got from Intel, and she started to ask me if I was stupid or something, like what was wrong with me that I wouldn't return the calls. So, and she kept this up all night. The next day she took me to the airport to go to Grenada. I checked in, got my ticket, and while I'm sitting there talking with her, she's harassing me about returning this call from Intel. So I said, yeah, I'll do it. And she said, no, why not call the office here? And she gave me $25 to go use a payphone. She insisted that I had to make that call before I got on the plane. So I made the call, spoke to the person at the Intel office in Barbados. They suggested that I come and meet with them. She's standing next to me. I'm trying to not do that. She insisted I should, so hung up the phone, went back to the airline, asked them to put me on a later flight, went to the Intel office in Barbados, met a guy there. He called somebody in Santa Clara, had me talk to somebody in Santa Clara, and then they said, this guy is going to come down in a few days, wants to talk to me. I said, okay, well, I'm going to Grenada anyway. So I went to Grenada, and they called me a few days later and said they wanted me to come back to Barbados to meet with this guy. And I said, can't do that right now because there is some stuff happening here and I'd like to see what's going on. But it turns out that was the time when some of you might have recalled there was a problem in Grenada, a communist government, and I was in Grenada around that time, and there was this talk about this palace coup happening, and I wanted to kind of experience that. So, so I decided that, this Intel thing could wait. As it turned out, this talk of this palace coup was going on for several days, and it didn't look like it was going to happen. So I decided, okay, I'll go up to Barbados today. I called him and I said, okay, this is a Wednesday. I'll come up today, and it'll be a day trip. I'll get back down before anything real happens. And so I fly out that morning. I get to Barbados, and that stuff happens while I'm in Barbados. So no, I can't get back to Grenada. The airport is closed. The communist guys are doing all that stuff. President Reagan decides to invade. So now I'm in Barbados for a week because the airports are closed, the U.S. is invaded, all kinds of stuff is happening. Now you have to understand, I was a college student, went there for a day, I had $20 in my pocket and no clothes. So I went to Intel and said, I have no money, I have no clothes. They put me up in a hotel, they give me $200 to go buy some new jeans and t-shirts. And I figured, shucks, this must be a pretty cool company. So I decided to take the job. And that's how I started working for Intel and ended up here. So I kind of strayed away a little bit. I wasn't really planning to talk about that and to share with you how stupid I was as a kid. But I mentioned about God sending people throughout my life to keep me on track. And there are several of those types of relationships that have kept me reconnected to God even when I was trying hard to go in different directions. And there are several people from my church today. I mentioned Dr. Stanley Long, my pastor, who've had a great relationship with me for many years. And I think I am probably one of the most, I've probably frustrated him more than probably anybody else every time he tries to get me involved in things. I remember when he tried to get me to join the church here, I had a big philosophical debate with him about why I didn't believe in joining a church. I said, I grew up in the Caribbean, you were a member of the church you went to. There was no formal joining of anything. Plus, he wanted me to take this class called something 101 or something. People from our church will remember that. And I said, I have no time for all of that. And so he decided he was going to come to my house and do the class with me there. And he really understands me. My wife is an elder in the church, and I often say to her, I don't respond to public announcements. if the pastor stands on the altar and says something, it doesn't resonate with me. I'm one of those one-on-one people. You got to come and talk to me one-on-one. And he understood that. And so he would come talk to me and tell me what he wanted me to do. And since then, we've been involved in a number of things, including, associate lecturers for John Maxwell's Foundation and others. And there are several such people that God has brought into my life. And one of those is Lip Bhutan, who some of you people might know, who is the founder of Walden International, the venture firm, and CEO of Cadence. And he is my partner as well, along with Michael Marks in WRV. Years ago, I would pray to God, and the investment business could be a tough business sometimes. Not from a job perspective. Don't get me wrong, it's not a tough job. But it could sometimes be a tough environment. It's an industry where your product is money. And when you have an industry where your product is money, it's hard not to fall in love with money. And the Bible talks about the love of money being the root of all evil. And so one has to be careful when you're in an industry where your product is money to not get too caught up. And I would pray, when we first started, our firm is a great firm, I have great partners and stuff, but so the problem wasn't the firm, the problem was me. I was worried, God, please make sure that I don't fall into this and become so in love with money and that I stray. And I'd known Lip Bhutan for many, many years. I had no idea he was a Christian, but we've known each other for, maybe 20 years. And I remember one day I was hanging out with him in his office, and he invited me to join a small group that he had. And in that small group of people like myself who were Christians, and some of us in the investment community and in other similar type of businesses. And I can tell you that group has helped me to remain grounded and ensure that I don't get too in love with money and the making of money. I've been asked, why am I in the investment business? Some people have asked me that, and how did I get in? I did not seek to get into the investment business. I never had a desire to be an investor. The investment business came to me. After Flextronics, Michael Marks joined KKR, and he tried to get me to join him there, and I didn't want to do that. And then one day we decided, let's go start our own investment firm, and that's how this happened. I had no idea what I was getting into. It's a good business. We have a good firm, and as I mentioned, I then did WRV. And sometimes I'm not sure what God is where He's exactly trying to take me through this experience. But I do believe that a big part of what God is trying to do through me has to do with helping others. And using my experience, growing up as a child of a diplomat, growing up as a child of a prime minister, the experience I've had living in multiple countries and seeing lots of different things, and the experiences of my own family, my grandfather's experience, my dad. My dad had to leave school after his father died at 16 to go to work to help support his family, and didn't go back to school till much later. So he didn't go to college until he was in his late 20s. And hearing about his experiences have led me to focus a lot on helping others. And I believe that part of what God is doing to me is, if you look at the childhood and the experiences I've had, He's brought a level of sensitivity to a certain type of people who don't have, people who don't have access. They may have abilities, but they don't have access. They're marginalized, they're neglected, they're ignored. And there's a sensitivity to that. And then He's brought me through my career into this kind of environment where I have access to not just financial capital, but intellectual capital. And the many problems this world faces are not an issue of financial capital. It's actually intellectual capital. And so I believe that I have access to this huge pool of intellectual and financial capital that God can use to help others. And so a few years ago, my wife and I started a foundation called the Petna Foundation. And this foundation is intended to help people who have no other opportunity. So we go look for the poorest people you can find, that we have access to, and try to help them through education, to be able to pursue their dreams. And I believe that through this, we are helping to influence not just individuals, but the next generation of leaders. This is not just about money either. For example, not only are we providing scholarships and so, but the most important thing is that we get to know these people. We invite them to come and spend Thanksgiving and Christmas and things like that. And we can actually influence them instead of just writing checks and ticking boxes. And I believe that is where God is leading me, and that is where I want to spend a lot of the rest of my life. But I want to, this is actually called a prayer breakfast. And I thought that before I stop and answer questions you might have, I want to share with you a couple of experiences I've had around prayer. For most of my life, even as a Christian, I did not really understand the value of prayer. I would pray because I thought I had to, and everybody said I had to, and I felt good, but I really wasn't sure if prayer really had power. I mean, I read about the power of prayer. I read about these things. I couldn't point to specific experiences that I had and say, I have personally experienced the power of prayer. Now, looking back, I can tell you, I know I've experienced the power of a lot of other people's prayers. Because I wouldn't be where I am without those prayers. But my personal prayer, I couldn't say that, I had experienced that. In fact, years ago, I told my wife that, I listened to people's testimonies, and I said, I don't have those experiences. I don't have experiences of having problems, going and praying about it, and the next day everything disappears and everything is all fine and dandy. I haven't had those experiences. But there are two experiences around prayer that I've had that were very, very powerful. And they both relate to my parents. Every time I prayed, I would ask God to please extend my parents' life, because I think my parents were just awesome people. And for me, I really wanted my kids to really know and understand and appreciate their grandparents. And I would pray and I would ask God, please, extend my parents' life. And then my mother had cancer and passed away at 70. She was 70 years old. And I was furious. And I remember stepping out of the shower one day and praying and saying, God, this whole prayer thing doesn't make any sense, because I don't understand why you will take my mother from me so young, and this is all I've ever asked you for. And while I was there, I was crying, and I felt like the Spirit was talking to me. And what I heard was, I actually granted you your prayers. And, so I started thinking about this. And what was revealed to me was in the period before my mother got sick, she actually came to California and she spent almost a year here with us. And as I thought about it, and as an engineer, of course, I started doing the calculations. And I realized that, the 2 or 3 weeks we would go and spend with her every year, if she had lived to be 85, we would not have spent as much time with her as we spent in that year before she died. And that was such an amazing revelation to me, that God actually answered my prayers. He didn't answer it the way I thought he should have, because I thought she should live to be 104 and then die peacefully in her sleep, but that's not the way it worked out. But he actually did answer my prayer. And the second one was my dad. So I kept praying the same thing. And I know my dad he believed in God and stuff, but he was not, he was not saved. And my dad lived to be 91 years old and passed away 2 years ago. And I was in India on business when I got a call saying my dad was not doing well. So he was in Grenada, I flew to Grenada, and I spent a week with him. And during that time, I would pray, and he was 91, and he was ready to go, to be honest with you. I remember sitting on the bed with him one day, and I was trying to convince him that we should go get some tests done, and he put his arms around my shoulder and he said, "Son, I'm not trying to live forever." So I knew he was ready. So I started to pray even more. And I said to God, I don't want my father to pass without knowing you as his Lord and Savior. And I felt again the Spirit said to me, well, go talk to him about it. So I did. And I completely messed it up. I got to be honest with you. I mean, my father is my hero. And here I am sitting with him in his last days trying to talk to him about, Christianity and Christ and all this stuff. This is the man that I used to go to for advice, and he told me what to do, and I'm trying to tell him what he should do. So I bungled it really badly, but I did get him to say, yes, I want to know Jesus as Lord and Savior, and I did do the prayer of salvation with him. And when I was done, I went to my room and I said, Lord, I know I screwed that up, and I felt the Lord said to me, I wasn't just depending on you, man. You just... I was just involving you. I wasn't depending. And a week later, my father passed away. And now I have a completely different perspective of prayer. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I hope that this was meaningful to you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Connect Silicon Valley. Conversations, faith, and life.